If you were an ancient Athenian citizen, the first thing you'd see is a man who was unbelievably ugly. His head was too big, his eyes were too large, his nose was all the wrong shape. Socrates' appearance breaks every rule of classical Greek aesthetics, of the idea of proportion and measure.
Socrates walked the streets of Athens barefoot, clad only in a dirty robe. He cared nothing for appearance or any of the other conventions of his day. Socrates was interested only in the mind. This unlikely figure would become the leader of a revolution. A revolution in thinking that had been gathering strength across the Greek world. This revolution had begun far to the east of Greece, in the legendary city of Babylon, where the world's first astronomers had gathered great records of the movement of the stars, the sun, and the moon, for they believed that these celestial bodies were gods. This knowledge and study of the heavens had been slowly spreading across the ancient world until it reached Greek colonies on the coast of what is modern-day Turkey. There, a shattering change occurred. For the Greeks took this astronomical knowledge and transformed it. They took the gods out of the heavens and replaced them with reason.
Gradually, the Greeks begin to say, these are not persons, these are things. There's an orderly world which the human mind can actually capture. It is subject to our understanding.
These Greeks began to calculate and predict the movement of the moon and stars through mathematics and logic, rather than using gods and spirits to explain everything. It was the birth of science. The first great Greek scientist, a man named Thales, wrote the earliest book on navigation and how to sail using the stars as a guide. And on a journey to Egypt, Thales was the first man to measure the height of the Great Pyramid.
Brilliant idea. He stood next to the pyramid until high noon, when his shadow was exactly the same length as his height. And at that point, he measured the shadow of the pyramid and accordingly knew the, the height of the pyramid, which is actually an application of a rather sophisticated geometrical theorem.
But Socrates was not interested in the stars and the heavens. He would use this new way of thinking, using reason and logic, to study people.
The great change comes with Socrates, who turns his back, so to speak, to the world of nature. What he cares about is the individual. You become an object of study and care.
Socrates spent his days in conversation, walking the streets of Athens, talking and debating with anyone he met. With over 150,000 people now packed behind Athens' walls, he was in his element.
One of the amazing things about Socrates is that he is the first fanatical urban individual. He loves the city. He makes life in the city one of his major concerns.
Socrates' life was spent questioning the assumptions his fellow Athenians held about their lives. What they felt was right and wrong, what was good and bad. And he was happy to turn convention upside down. One of Socrates' followers recorded how, at the end of a drunken dinner party, Socrates proved to a fellow guest that he was in fact the better looking of the two.
My eyes must be more beautiful because they bulge out, and therefore I can see better. And by the same account, my nose is more beautiful because my nostrils flare out, and so I can therefore gather in more smells.
This is typical Socrates, using reason and logic to examine the world anew.
Socrates says you must make every decision based on your own understanding of what is good and what is not good, what is right and what is wrong.
For Socrates, this freedom of thought was paramount, even if it meant upsetting the whole notion of a beautiful nose.
I tell you, let no day pass without discussing all the things about which you hear me talking. A life without this sort of examination is not worth living.
But as Socrates spent his days in debate, his city was fighting a war. The Spartans invaded Athenian territory and set about burning all the farmland around the city. The Athenians became increasingly anxious. They could only watch from the city walls as their fields and crops were destroyed. But such was Pericles' reputation, he managed to convince the Athenians to stick with his plan. The city could rely on her fleet and shipments from overseas to survive. Little did Pericles know that this fleet now carried an even greater threat. One year into the war, the grain boats that fed the city brought with them an additional cargo: plague. A disease that would now devastate Athens.
Pericles' plan couldn't anticipate difficulties that we now would suggest were rather likely in those circumstances of crowding. And the results were horrendous.
With the population crammed behind the city walls, the affliction spread like wildfire. The symptoms were horrific. The Athenian historian Thucydides, who lived through these years, recorded its effects.
The body was suddenly seized, first with violent heats around the head and redness and inflammation of the eyes. And then the disease descended into the bowels, producing violent ulceration and uncontrollable diarrhea. The sufferings of individuals seemed almost beyond the capacity of human nature.
Sufferers, racked with fever and overcome with unquenchable thirst, would crawl into the city cisterns and water mains to die.
The city must have looked terrible, smelled terrible, been awful to be in, and terror must have reigned everywhere.
The plague would kill over a third of Athens' population. And then it struck the city's figurehead, Pericles. Plutarch, Pericles' biographer, described his symptoms.
The plague seized Pericles, not with sharp and violent fits, but with a dull and lingering distemper, wasting the strength of his body and undermining his noble soul.
By the end, the patrician hero of the city was reduced to relying on potions and magic in an attempt to cure himself.
He showed one of his friends a charm that a woman had hung around his neck, as if to say that he was very sick indeed when he would admit of such foolery as this.
Finally, after 6 months of lingering illness, Pericles died in 429 BC. Pericles had planned to make Athens into the Mediterranean's greatest power. But his carefully calculated strategy had brought only disease and death.
Like most brilliant men, like most people who have had great success all their lives, Pericles simply underestimated the degree to which some things are out of the control of the very best intelligence and the very best knowledge that there are.
Pericles' death would have far-reaching consequences. It soon became clear that this one man had been the linchpin of the Athenian state. Without a single strong leader, countless figures now scrambled for the top position. And they were happy to do anything the people wanted, if it gave them power. For Pausanias, the effects were swift and dramatic.
Pericles' successors, who now wanted to occupy the top position, simply followed the prejudices and passions of the masses in order to gain support.
Athenian democracy now revealed a new and terrifying potential. The potential to slide into mob rule, crippling her ability to fight a war. As the conflict raged on, an Athenian naval force won a skirmish with the Spartans in rough and storm-tossed seas. The generals who had commanded the force returned to Athens expecting a hero's welcome. Instead, they were thrown into prison. The storm had forced the Athenian commanders to sail straight back to Athens, without picking up any of their soldiers who had fallen overboard during the battle. Rabble-rousing speakers had convinced the assembly that this failure to rescue the men was a crime so appalling that all the generals should be summarily tried and executed.